Marcy Darnovsky. I'm the Associate Director here at the Center for Genetics and Society. And I want to welcome you very warmly to our offices for this really important set of speakers. I've just been so struck hearing what all these speakers have said about how many stories there are here that have not really been covered. So I think it's an amazing opportunity, and I want to warmly welcome all of you folks who are here for a series of events focused on synthetic biology being held here in the Bay Area this week. I'll just tell you a little bit, 2 sentences about the Center for Genetics and Society. We are working toward responsible uses and governance of human genetic and reproductive technologies. That's our mission. And our specific entry point into concerns about synthetic biology has to do with proposals for human applications of synthetic biology techniques, which I think it was the Etc. group, Jim Thomas's group, calls this genetic engineering on steroids. So we are also, of course, very concerned about the general issues of scientific responsibility, of the need for taking a sensibly precautionary approach to powerful new technologies, and to really trying to avoid more cycles of biotech hype that we've seen over and over around these issues, and a concern that synthetic biology is the next one to be entering that unfortunate cycle. So there's a lot of information that you're going to hear from the speakers that you have in your press packets. Just a little bit of housekeeping stuff before we start. There's a restroom key hanging up near the door, and the restrooms are to your left, past the second courtyard, and then into the double doors there. What we're going to do here is have statements from the speakers, and then a time for Q&A. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Conant, who is the Communications Director for Global Justice Ecology Project.
Global Justice Ecology Project is a small organization that works to raise awareness of issues at the intersection of environmental justice, social justice, racial justice, and economic justice. And we look a lot at what we call the false solutions to the climate crisis. And we believe that synthetic biology is one of those false solutions. And that's why we are participating in bringing together the event that we'll be holding tomorrow, Unmasking the Bay Area Biolabs and Synthetic Biology, that will be here at the Brower Center down the street. And that's also why we are really excited to bring together all of these voices to talk about the different angles that we need to be concerned about regarding synthetic biology and regarding really the redesign of the Bay Area and to some extent the redesign of the global economy around what is being framed as a green renewable initiative. The second campus of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which has been announced to be built in Richmond, is of great concern to all of us because essentially they haven't told us what is going to be going on there. We know that the Joint Genomics Institute will be there. We know that the Joint Bioenergy Institute will be there. And we know that these institutions engage in synthetic biology. What we don't know is the ramifications of synthetic biology for the Bay Area and for the world. The public pronouncements have all focused on innovation, green jobs, renewables. Just this morning, CBS San Francisco put out an article describing the renewable biofuels that will be developed there. But we don't know, we are not told much about what this actually looks like and what the impacts will be for local folks, which is why we've brought together voices who have not had a chance to intercede in this question. So I will be introducing our panelists one by one. Aside from the folks on the panel, Richard Hayes from for Genetics and Society can speak to you afterwards. And Richard Brenneman, who is a member of the press right here in the front row, has been writing about this issue, about the lab, about the Richmond Field Station for many years, and is a great wealth of knowledge. So we hope you'll stick around and interview some of these folks. To begin with, I want to introduce Jim Thomas from ETC Group. Jim is the program manager with ETC Group. He tracks developments across several emerging areas of technology, including geoengineering, genomics, and nanotechnology, and is one of the leading critics of the synthetic biology industry. He was lead author of the 2007 report, Extreme Genetic Engineering. lead author of the new Biomasters, Synthetic Biology, and the Next Assault on Biodiversity and Livelihoods.
Great. Thank you very much for hosting that. It's very much appreciated, especially to be able to have a chance to talk about what this new industry means right here at the heart of this new industry. And hopefully I'll touch on that in a moment. So, as Jeff said, I work for the Etc. Group. We're a very small watchdog organization that's been around for about 35 years, and we track emerging technologies and look at the impacts of those emerging technologies, particularly on the marginalized groups in the global south. And probably for about 7, 8 years now, we've been watching the emergence of synthetic biology as an area that at first we thought was just an interesting sort of area within biosciences, and at tremendous speed has turned into a nascent and very fast-growing industry. And really the point, I think, at which we began to notice that something very significant was happening around this synthetic biology was a conference here in Berkeley back in 2006, where the synthetic biology community had a meeting called Synthetic Biology 2.0, where they announced that they were going to try and create a set of voluntary regulations for oversight of their own field. And they were very, very candid that this was a way to try and stave off regulation, because there was beginning to be concern that this technology would need some sort of regulation. And that attempt to push through a bunch of voluntary guidelines was met by a sort of emergency letter. In fact, I was trying to attend that meeting and refused. It was here in Berkeley campus. So instead, 38 organized, including the Center for Genetics and Society, and I think Global Justice Ecology Project and Friends of the Earth, wrote a letter saying that oversight of yourself, voluntary oversight of this field, is absolutely the wrong way to go with what could potentially be such a risky technology. That was 2006. Now, 6 years later, we still don't have oversight of this technology, but we have rather a large industry. Just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the World Economic Forum pronounced that they thought synthetic biology was going to be one of the key industrial technologies for the next 30 years. And that echoes statements that we hear across, whether it's the National Science Foundation or in Europe, in the European Union, that synthetic biology increasingly is being positioned as one of the enabling technologies creating a bioeconomy. You know, beyond the knowledge economy, we're going to move into this high-tech bioeconomy, and it's going to depend very much on synthetic biology. Just for context, last week, 2 weeks ago, 111 organizations released this, which is a document laying out principles for how there should be oversight of synthetic biology. Those organizations are from around the world, but this calls for some very sensible and obvious things, that we need precautionary approach to health and safety, that we need to be looking at questions of ownership and control, that we shouldn't be, there's a call here for a moratorium on release, environmental release and commercial release, and we can talk a little bit about that, and one specific call for a ban, which is a ban on human applications of this technology, because there's quite serious implications there for re-engineering not just the human genome, but also the microbes that live on the body, and a lot of work that's going on now is on that. And in fact, also, just again for context, at the moment the UN Convention on Biological Diversity is about to discuss at the end of this coming month, whether synthetic biology should be one of its new and emerging issues. So there is if people are interested, I have a submission that was prepared by a number of organizations laying out some of the concerns for the environment, for livelihoods, and so forth, and that's going to get discussed by 192 countries in Montreal at the end of April. So there is a growing concern, just not only from civil society, actually also from ethics commissions and so forth. We had the President Obama's Bioethics Commission, that all started by looking at synthetic biology, and yet we have a growing industry. It's considered that there's about $6 billion the market for synthetic biology products at the moment. There's probably around somewhere between 50 and 100 synthetic biology companies, and the Bay Area is absolutely the heart of that. There's about 20 synthetic biology companies that I can identify just within the area, and they are mostly focused on biofuels and biomaterials. A lot of them are coming out of one particular lab of Jay Kiesling, who's also the head of JBay, the Joint Bio Institute, which is now going to be the kind of key institution in the new Richmond lab. And he's the founder of Amyris Biotechnologies, which has about 24 different joint ventures with everybody from Chevron and Shell, and actually not Chevron in the case of Amherst, Shell and Total and Mercedes and Boeing and some of the largest grain traders, and has facilities in Brazil already. He's founder of LS9, which is working with Chevron and Procter & Gamble. He's founder of Lygos. We're seeing out of these synthetic biology labs a lot of startup companies that are then very much being controlled by very large investments from the largest energy, chemical, and pharmaceutical and grain companies. In fact, if you look at the top 10 energy companies, 6 of them have synthetic biology investments, some of them quite deep investments, particularly P, who of course gave $500 million to the Energy Biosciences Institute here, also headed up by Jay Kiesling. You look at the chemical industry, again, 6 of the top 10 chemical companies in the world have synthetic biology investments and joint ventures. Some of those, such as DuPont and Dow and so forth, have very significant, particularly DuPont, very significant interest. Again for grains, again for pharmaceuticals. What we're talking about here is a set of what you might call extreme genetic engineering techniques. Synthetic biology differs from the genetic engineering that we've used since the early 1970s in that it's not simply cutting and pasting existing bits of DNA, it's printing them out, making DNA synthetically. So we have machines that are called DNA synthesizers. They're about this big. You have a set of bottles of chemicals, and you type into it, I want a piece of DNA that says GCC, TCCCA as a long molecule, and it prints it out. And once you've done that, you can then use those strands of DNA to program, suppose, a microbe, a virus, or indeed to build an entire virus. So we've had a number of times where, for example, the smallpox virus, not smallpox, the polio virus has been built probably about 6 or 7 times now from scratch, and it's then infectious and it works. This is a human-made virus. We have most of these companies, what they're doing is they're building synthetic DNA to put into yeast and bacteria such that they become like little factories that eat sugar and spit out something similar to petroleum or some sort of plastic or some sort of material. And also a lot of work going on trying to build new viruses that can go into the human body and start to attack selectively, whether it's cancers or other organs within the body. And we'll talk about the issues that these raise. They range from very clear safety issues. You're building entirely new stretches of DNA synthetically that have often no analog in nature, where it's poorly understood how they operate. It's certainly poorly understood how they operate once you release them into the environment. These are living things, they reproduce. And there will be escapes, there absolutely will be escapes. And so nobody yet knows how to evaluate the impact on the environment of synthetic organisms escaping. Nobody's even started to look at question. There's concerns about biowarfare, that this is a wonderful way to build extremely nasty viruses and bacteria that can be used as biowarfare agents. There's a real serious concern about disruption, that a lot of these companies are trying to build natural bugs that create natural materials such as vanilla and other things that farmers currently grow, and this is going to affect their market. So there's an international dimension here. And that these industries, as they scale up, are going to use large amounts of sugar, and that sugar is largely going to come from places like Brazil or places like sub-Saharan Africa, and so we're seeing a land grab already, and I think Nnimmo will talk a bit to this. And there's some very straightforward, just ethics questions. Should we be intervening at this level in this hubristic way? So I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have more questions about this later on.
Next, we have Nnimmo Bassey, who is the Executive Director of Environmental Rights Action in Nigeria.
And thank you all for coming. From Jim's presentation, it's very clear that corporations are running wild in the world from the Silicon Valley. When we hear about this part of the world, we think about computers and nice things. But what is coming out these days are potentially very nasty. And this is why I got so worried that I had to come up just for these events. We see corporations who are getting out of control. And it's very shocking to see that the same set of corporations who are causing disasters around the world, BP, Chevron, Shell, and the rest, they're the same people, the same corporations who are investing in this unregulated sector of synthetic biology. You know, when we hear about this new science. It sounds very neat and clean, but to produce what they need to produce with a lot of sugar, especially biofuels and agrofuels, they're going to need massive amount of land. Even what some speak about using forest waste and using marginal land, but the concept of marginal land is just used to marginalize people further, and there's really no waste in the forest. Everything is interrelated, and this is what the proponents of synthetic biology have failed to acknowledge, that there's a whole link between all forms of life. There's no single life form that is independent of the next. The planet is one, is holistic, and disrupting organisms and life forms the way synthetic biology is trying to do ignores the evolutionary balance that has been built over millions of years. And when there is a problem, there'll be no way, I don't see any way we're going to recall any of these artificial lives released into the environment. And as Jim said, there's no foolproof way of keeping them, locking them in the laboratory, or having them in the field and not having to contaminate wider areas and places that you cannot control. I remember reading about why rabbits were introduced to Australia. And they were introduced to Australia for sport, for people to just shoot a few rabbits. And within a few years, I had millions of rabbits all over the place, and it was a big problem trying to control them. But rabbits you could see and recognize as rabbits. But synthetic life, with life forms that you can't even see with your naked eyes or with normal microscopes. These are going to just run wild, and these corporations that are not being controlled will simply deny what harm they've done to the planet. And this is a big, big issue. We can't allow these corporations in Silicon Valley or elsewhere to play God. They are simply not God, no matter what they think they are. They can't. You may think you are creating life, but what kind of life are you creating? As I said, there's a balance. Everything in nature has a way of being controlled also by nature. But we'll have these artificial things. We're going to have a new form of colonialism, biocolonialism. And apart from colonizing and grabbing lands in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and Latin America, we're going to have a new form of, how would I put it? There's this thing that these monopolists do. They create something, and then they create the antidote. So they're going to create new diseases and hopefully create the solutions for those diseases and new problems, but most likely they won't be able to have a solution to the problems they're creating. This is why we need very strong regulations. And this is why, again, I should emphasize that we need a precautionary principle. Whenever there's a possibility that something will go wrong, people with intelligence should exercise caution. The way this whole process is going is reckless, it's uncontrolled, it's all about money, it's all about the power. Capital has become a creed, and technology is now the high priest. I think this needs to be controlled and stopped. And this is why we're gathered in the Bay Area this week to talk about this evil and to call for caution.
All right. Becky McClain's story is really a cautionary tale about what we're looking at, not only what is to come, but what we're already facing. Becky McClain is a molecular biologist and the first successful whistleblower in the biotech field. In 2010, she won a civil lawsuit against Pfizer for the company's willful and wanton disregard of her free speech and for whistleblower claims involving public safety issues. McClain was injured and became ill while she worked as a scientist in an embryonic stem cell lab and has become since then an outspoken advocate for worker safety rights, public health and safety, and the director of the Injured Workers National Network.
Thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I want to make it clear that I'm very happy to have won a civil claim for $1.37 million for Pfizer's violation of my free speech rights concerning safety matters of public concern. What I want you to realize is that in between winning the civil claim and my first speaking out about safety was a whole network a federal regulatory framework that I had to go through before I could file a civil claim, and it all failed. The synthetic biology leadership saying that self-policing is going to work, it's a falsehood. It doesn't work. In my case, it all failed. And that's what the reporters should be looking at. Why did the regulatory framework, in my case, which was so egregious, why didn't it work? The jury, in fact, not only awarded me $1.37 million, but they awarded punitive damages because of willful and wanton disregard. So synthetic biology, of course, is offering even more dangers. It will not only create new life forms, synthetic life forms, but also synthetic entities like synthetic DNA, genetic circuits that are synthetic, and it could change the very humanness that we are. The failure, in my opinion, of why the regulatory framework failed was because there's weak laws to protect for safety and free speech of scientists, amazing, massive amounts of conflicts of interest between government, academia, and industry, and then there's a lack of integrity and leadership in our scientific leadership. My background is that I'm a 23-year molecular biologist. I started when to make a genetically engineered virus was very difficult. You had to be very skilled, up to the point when I left Pfizer, where now they make genetically engineered viruses with a kit, like a Betty Crocker cake mix. Add tube B, tube C, and you have a virus. So now unskilled, untrained biologists can make a genetically engineered virus. So the times not only have advances move forward, but also the access to these advanced technologies. What does a danger look like? Looks like this. This is what it will look like in a lab. It looks very innocuous. You would never think that, how can you know this is going to be harmful? So in a lab environment, it would not be unlikely that all of us would be scientists, and Jim could have 100 of these tubes in front of him. Nnimmo could have 10, and all in one lab. And who knows who's working with what? How do you regulate this? So let me get back on a few issues. I basically want to tell you not too much what my complaints were, but why it failed. So we had issues that we found. Tubes like this that we discovered were genetically infectious agents in our break area where we ate and drank. A woman found a test tube in her Coke once. We had samples, blood samples that contained agents that were 60% fatal in humans. I brought these forward. I was told to stop documenting these in the safety committee that I was a member of. I became hostile retaliation against me, and before I left, someone with one of these tubes that had a genetically engineered virus used it next to my office, and I got exposed and became very, 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 very ill. What happened when I went to OSHA? Pfizer denied all my complaints. All regulatory agencies failed, from going into inspecting Pfizer. Even when I had documents that people were falling ill, they failed to go and inspect. My illness, when I asked for my exposure records, Pfizer said that trade secrets superseded my right to those, and that's what I ended up in going into a civil claim because I was so sick. I was ambulance rides, emergency room visits, hospitalization, and my doctor and I wanted exposure records for my health care, and Pfizer was saying trade secret supersedes my right to these. So also the whistleblower complaint, the federal framework didn't protect me. I had to win that in civil court. So the laws are weak. There's no framework that really protects the public health and safety. Remember, I eventually will get some money. I don't have the money yet. It's been 10 years since my initial complaint. But my winning a civil case does not protect public health and safety. Conflicts of interest. So when I went out to seek academic help with my illness, because I was working on these technologies, I'm quite familiar with these technologies. Amazing conflicts of interest. Yale, Columbia University, Stanford University, who gets tons of money from Pfizer, acted in unethical manners. Let me just give you one example. The Department of Public Health, Connecticut, started an investigation, and they called me up. Oh, we're stopping the investigation because a prominent scientist from Stanford University said that you couldn't possibly have become ill. Well, I knew. It was recorded that it was for sure a fact that this was a human infectious agent. Okay, how would he know I didn't become ill? So they finally released his name to me, and I looked him up on the internet, and he's getting $450 million from Pfizer, from a company. So, I mean, this is just one of many, many, many stories of conflicts of interest, and it's horrible. It's just. The last thing I want to mention is this. This was published 6 months ago, not even a year ago, in Science, the #1 really scientific publication in America. It says synthetic biology. The first sentence basically says, for 40 years, this biotechnology has been completely safe. Well, the Injured Workers National Network knows that people have died, people have lost their legs and arms, people have come down with serious illnesses, and this scientific leadership can print this in a prestigious journal? I'm appalled. I think the bottom line is that we're giving the scientific community freedom to self-police and self-regulate, but that comes with the necessity for responsibility, which also mandates a system of justice, and we don't have the system of justice. With corporations now so intimately involved in science, it even increases the dangers because of the conflicts of interest. Thank you.
Next, we have Steve Zeltzer, who is the founder of the California Coalition for a Workers' Memorial Day and is an outspoken advocate for organized labor and workers' rights.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank the organizations for hosting this conference. I think it's really historic that this issue is coming up. This is the first time that there's been this kind of conference to talk about the potential dangers and threats to workers and the public of synthetic biotechnology. And this comes, as the other people have said, at a time when the industry has spent billions of dollars on this already. So we're talking about an industry that's in full flowering. And we haven't looked at the potential downside to that industry. Our organization, California Coalition for Workers' Memorial Day, was formed to commemorate workers who are killed on the job and workers who get sick and have to fight for their health care in this society, and also to protect health and safety. And our concern with this new technology is that there is not proper oversight, as Becky has said, and in the biotech industry, nanotech, synthetic biotechnology, there's not proper oversight. And what we've learned is that not only is there not proper oversight, but workers are getting sick in this industry, biotech workers, and they cannot even prove to where they've gotten sick to get their health care under workers' comp law. So what we have in California, for example, is a whole category of workers in the biotech industry who don't have proper health care as a result of being unable to prove that they've been injured at a biotech lab. This is a whole new issue of health care. If you can't get health care for biotech workers because they have to prove how they've been injured and they can't prove it because of the new technology, that means they're excluded from protection under workers' comp law. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of workers. Additionally, workers are afraid to speak out in the biotech industry. They have to sign secrecy agreements, and they're afraid that if they talk about what's going on in the laboratory, they'll be sued and they'll lose everything they have. So there's a fear of workers about talking about health and safety concerns. And as Becky has said, you raise these concerns of health and safety and you're fired, as she was. The other aspect of this is that in California, the industry says, don't worry, everything's under control. But what we've discovered, our organization, is that Cal OSHA, which is responsible for the 18 million workers in California, has only one doctor on the staff. One doctor for 18 million workers. Now, these new technologies, synthetic biotechnology, they require professionals, medical doctors, to understand what you're dealing with. These are not simple diseases, simple dangers. It requires a medical professional. We only have one doctor in California for the 18 million workers. So what this means is the industrial hygienists are not trained for biotechnology. We have a gap in California of oversight and medical staff who are prepared to understand what the dangers of this new technology is and how workers can be in threat and the public. And it's not just, as has been pointed out, a worker issue, it's a public issue. Because if these are released in the environment, there's no oversight, really, an investigation of potential dangers to the public and to workers. So we have cases now in California with David Bell at AgriQuest, owned by Pam Marone from Monsanto, that people are getting infected, people are getting sick, and then their workers' comp is denied, and they have to fight for their health care. They're only saving or being saved because of Social Security. So this is a serious issue. It's a growing issue for the workers of California and the public, and something that we are going to be addressing at this conference. So it'll be very important for all working people and biotech workers to hear these issues. And we're breaking the information blockade by having this conference to get this information out so they'll be able to understand potential dangers and threats to their health and safety. Thank you.
Our final panelist will be Gopal Dayaneni. Gopal co-directs the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology project, which engages grassroots, racial, economic, and environmental justice organizers on the intersections of ecology, economy, and empire. Movement Generation calls itself a thought and action tank that is collectively organized and based here in the East Bay.
Thank you for all coming out and hearing us talk a little bit. I just want to say, in addition to working at Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project, I've lived in the East Bay for a long time, and I've worked for over a decade alongside grassroots organizations and community-based groups in Richmond and throughout the Bay Area in confronting a host of environmental justice concerns, and in particular the Chevron refinery in Richmond, California, and the associated petrochemical industries that come along with that refinery. Richmond is, in addition to being the home of one of the biggest environmental threats to the Bay Area and to the climate, the largest stationary source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of California. It is also the home of some of the most innovative economic and green economy solutions out there, from training programs for young people in weatherization and solar installation to a new Office of Cooperative Development to look for new ways of building the economic infrastructure of Richmond and get it off of this one company town. And if you're a city like Richmond, and you have a strong progressive history, as Richmond does, and you have the host of economic problems that Richmond does, the idea of public investment in green energy seems like a really good idea. I mean, who doesn't want public investment in green energy? But I think what we're experiencing here is a wolf in sheep's clothing, or in the case of Jay Kiesling and his empire of companies, it's more like a genetically, synthetically engineered wolf to look like a sheep on the outside. And by that I mean what we are talking about is the hijacking of public institutions for private interests. I think that's one of the things that people really need to look into and understand about, particularly this lab, but also the some of the underlying claims of the synthetic biology industry and proponents. There's a famous expression: you have to speculate to accumulate, and here we're talking about rampant speculation. There isn't anything certain about any of the claims, but there are certain, there is certainty in the way those claims are made. So we are seeing the creation of a whole new kind of economic bubble, and when it bursts, it won't just burst in terms of the economic consequences. It has the potential to have serious health, safety, ecological consequences, and that's really the basis of the concern. And I want to really point at some of the specific ones. First of all, the idea for a city, for for a city like Richmond to go from being a one-company town to being another kind of one-company town, where that company turns out to look like Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories, but is really simply essentially a shell institution for a host of corporate interests and experimental research, has serious implications for actually what Richmond really needs, which is a diversified economy. And I know that that the city of Richmond and lots of grassroots organizations in Richmond and community groups in Richmond have been calling for this kind of diversification. And I think if people had the opportunity to see through the smoke and look at the fire that synthetic biology really is, they would realize that this is in fact a false solution to the jobs claim. The other big thing that you hear about this lab, and the only thing that anybody, proponents of the lab, want to talk about is biofuels and clean energy, and the idea that we're going to get off of the Chevron refinery and get on to this new, coming out of nowhere, wonderful synthetic fuel that we're going to grow in petri dishes. I happen to have recently seen The Sound of Music, because my daughter's really into The Sound of Music. And there's a really important line in that movie, which is nothing comes from nothing and nothing ever could. The agrofuels and the synthetic biology industry is talking about converting massive amounts of land, labor, and life into this kind of this supposed agrofuels for the sake of claiming greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Right? And when you kick people off their land, and when you strip the land bare, when you take biodiverse forests and turn them into monocrops in order to create feedstock for a sugar economy, then you're not talking about greenhouse gas emissions reductions. This is the classic carbon fundamentalism of companies like Chevron, which of course are invested in synthetic biology, and the classic arguments made by government and government institutions like the Pentagon, which are invested in synthetic biology, and the claim that gets the shiny veneer of the University of California, Berkeley, which is of course now invested in synthetic biology. So it's not green. Green doesn't mean what you think it means. It's not jobs, because jobs apparently doesn't mean what you think it means. Given that it is speculative, it is a bubble, when if the amount of energy and resources and investment dries up, which we've seen it happen over and over again, that the city of Richmond and the communities in Richmond will be burdened with the economic costs of that failed experiment. And I'm getting a nice note here, a good reminder. We live on the eastern edge of the Ring of Fire. We just last year watched the Fukushima disaster, and we heard people from the U.S. government, like Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, saying no one ever could have predicted this. We're talking about 90% of the earthquakes on the planet. You don't build a nuclear power plant on the edge of the Ring of Fire, and you don't build synthetic biology labs on the edge of the Ring of Fire either. We are destined to have a major earthquake in California and in the Bay Area, and we should be very careful what kind of infrastructure we build and where we build it. So if for no other reason other than this is a bad place, a fault line is a very bad place to put synthetic, novel, microbial life forms that do industrially useful activity that's going to go right into the bay in the wake of a massive earthquake. That seems like a good enough reason alone to take a big step back.
Just to wrap up, in the press release that Lawrence Berkeley Labs sent out this morning, Jay Kiesling said it speculates that the U.S. could replace about half of the amount of foreign oil this country imports annually through synthetic biology. And, quote, he said that his team is up to the challenge. But the question is his team ready to clean up the mess? And with that, we've got the space for as long as you members of the press need, so have at it. Could say who you are before you
Steve Jones of the Bay Guardian. Can you talk a little bit more, maybe Nnimmo, about the sort of amount of land that we're talking about, and whether we're seeing those impacts now, or kind of like when that's expected to sort of peak, and what the full impacts of that are going to be?
Land grabs especially became a public issue with regard to land being grabbed for cultivation of crops, for food and for agrofuels. America and Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia. Recently, there's been a report in Europe about Lufthansa trying to go green by using biofuels from crops planted in Indonesia. And this crop was jatropha. And jatropha is presented as a wonder crop that grows on marginal land. It doesn't need water, it doesn't need anything. You just plant it and then money grows on the tree. This has been shown to be completely false, because jatropha on marginal land produces marginal fruits and oils. And so just to meet the biofuels requirement of the aviation industry in Europe, will require by 2020, up to 3.5 million hectares of land. And they're saying by 2050, they would have gone much higher than they would have increased up to they would require about 350 million hectares, about the size of Belgium, just to feed the aviation industry. Now, in Africa already, we're having land grabs have caused political conflict. It caused this in Madagascar, when the South Korean company Daewoo tried to buy 1.3 million hectares of land, of arable land, for almost half the arable land on that country. We also had a case in South Sudan, before Sudan split into two. It's an American company called the Nile Trading Company that speculated. I think they're one of these conflict speculators, or sovereignty speculators. They earmark countries that are going to split, and they invest there in the part they believe they can have influence on. And they bought about 400 hectares of land for $25,000. I mean, and then the kind of agreement they signed was that they could do anything: drill for oil and gas, mine the territory, grow crops for agrofuels, and timber, and even the biomass for $25,000, and to do this for about 49 years. So we're having a very serious situation where farmers are being tricked to cultivate crops that only one industry can buy. For example, jatropha cannot be eaten, it's not edible. And so if you grow the crops and the company that said they will need the oil does not want it anymore, then farmers are stranded. A lot of farmers are getting impoverished in Indonesia already, and they don't know where to turn to. So it's a major issue in these places, because farmers who would normally grow crops for food are now growing crops for machine. And they're being pushed off their lands, as Gopal mentioned. And increasingly, this will be generating more and more conflict. Just like any other resource conflict, land grab is like the impacts of extractive sector on Africa, for example.
Could I ask for clarification for a moment? I'm Dave Perlman for the San Francisco Chronicle. Millions of hectares. Could you give us one example? The one I caught at the very beginning was somebody would be using 3.5 million hectares of land. I need to know just where that would be, what corporate interest is buying that land. I assume as speculation for future use in synthetic biology, but I wasn't quite clear.
Yeah, this is not for synthetic biology.
Oh.
This is for production.
Created as a result of synthetic biology research, right?
Well, it's related, because it's just one step. They're having many different generations of biofuels. Only fourth generation will be using synthetic biology, Jim. Am I right?
Yeah, that's the only fourth generation.
Exactly. So the 3.5 million hectares of land will be needed in Indonesia.
And where?
Indonesia.
Oh, in
Indonesia, yes.
What is the crop that you mentioned?
Jatropha.
What?
Jatropha.
Jatropha?
Jatropha.
It has a strange name, a strange crop. It's actually used in many villages to make hedges around gardens, because the seeds are not edible, but they have 30% oil in it.
Can I speak a little bit to this? I mean, we're seeing at the moment this massive land grab that's happening in the South, in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly Southern and Southeast Asia. The World Bank did a study a few years ago where they found that around 500 million hectares of land had been grabbed in the last, I think, so 6 or 7 years. And according to that study, which underplays the level of the land grab, and this was some years ago, just a few years ago, they thought that about 21% of those land grabs were biofuel related. And that's probably grown since then. I remember, in fact, I think your organization did a study looking at Africa and said that just in 11 countries, an area the size of Denmark had been grabbed for biofuels. So, you know, it's moving on a pace. I think what's key about synthetic biology in relation to biofuels is the first generation of biofuels, corn and palm oil and so forth, have been, well, so now we're moving on to the second and third and fourth generation, where the idea is, can we take biomass, can we take forest wood chips, can we take grasses, can we take any old biomass we want and digest it and turn it into a fuel? And to do that requires synthetic biology. It's becoming clear that if you look at the top 50 hottest bioenergy companies, they're all synthetic biology companies. So this is essential to reaching this so-called next generation of biofuels. That is actually central to Obama's plan on bioenergy, and not just the US government, but all the OECD countries. So moving from this first generation of bioenergy that has been a disaster in terms of pushing up food prices and impact on forests in Indonesia and so forth, to some mythical next generation is going to require exactly this work that's going to be going on right now at J-Bay, and it's going to be in the Richmond lab. But what it really does amount to, if it works, it means that forests, wood chips, any old grasses suddenly become commercially valuable. They become a source of oil, effectively. And that changes, you know, that then drives further grabs. I think, for me, a very key statistic is that 86% of the world's biomass, the living stuff, is in the tropics. And so if you're a company like Amyris, which is Jay Kiesling started, which is now set up in Brazil and is looking at sub-Saharan Africa, of course, where you go is to the tropics. And it has cheap land, cheap labor. You make deals with sugar companies, and that's exactly what they're doing. So that's the dynamic around this industry. And while it's being sold as a green, clean, kind of science-based enterprise here in the East Bay, you know, the view from the sugar fields of Brazil, which are largely, to a large extent, slave labor, is anything but that. So.
Why is that next step being taken, though? I mean, because right now biomass is being turned into biofuels. Is it a matter of efficiency why they want
Scale.
synthetic biology?
It's a matter of scale.
Yeah, but at the moment, biofuels are being largely made by sugars. So you can turn sugars into ethanol. What synthetic biology supposedly allows you to do, and there's some questions around this, is that you design Amyris they have a yeast that turns sugar into diesel, or it turns sugar into jet fuel. So the fuel that you're actually producing is higher quality. It can go straight into a car. You don't need to change any of the infrastructure, and so that's the first thing you do. And the second thing is you create new enzymes that allow you to break down wood, cellulose, which at the moment is very difficult to do. So I don't know if that shows the shift.
So it wouldn't be sugars, it could be wood.
Well, so it's the sugar in wood, it's the cellulose. And that's what most of, it's the most abundant, cellulose is the most abundant organic chemical on the planet. And if you can make that an industrial feedstock, then you've just opened up a brand new industry.
Robert Rogers, RichmondCompetition.org and the West County Times. I think my question is for Gopal. Richmond, of course, is the council and the city leaders there made a very robust appeal for the LBNO lab, which is ultimately successful. At that local level, why are they wrong? Why is Richmond not going to benefit from the investment? And what they say is that it's going to help diversify the economy there.
Yeah. I appreciate the predicament that Richmond is in. It's sort of trying to get itself out of a crisis created by primarily Chevron to a large degree as the economic driver, but also the driver of the economic crisis for the city of Richmond. There's a couple of things I think. First of all, diversifying the economy. It's sort of like a one-trick pony solution is kind of part of the problem. It's this idea that we're going to bring in another big, massive industry that we become extremely dependent on its success. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is the degree to which this is all very speculative. There is an enormous amount of uncertainty about the true economic possibilities in terms of long-term economic development. So it's bubble economics, and we all know that bubbles burst. So that's another big reason to really take a big step back and think about it. And Jeff can talk a little bit more about this, but also the idea that that they're going to get the level of environmental review and that's required to actually make sure that it meets the muster of safety. I mean, you think about how hard it was to slow and eventually stop the expansion of the Richmond refinery, the Chevron refinery. This project has the potential to be exempted from major California environmental review, I think the other big thing is for me is that there's just a lot of not knowing what's really at stake in terms of the bigger implications. Like short-term economic growth and long-term ecological degradation don't add up. So it's easy to imagine the quick fix of the short-term job gains, but when you start to step back and imagine the real costs to communities of potential biohazard spills, the real cost to workers of being forced to interact with materials that nothing in nature has evolved defense against, right? So much of this technology depends on nanoscale engineering, things operating at the scale of 1/80,000th the diameter of a human hair. Nothing exists stably like that in nature, which is why nothing in nature has evolved a defense against it. So these are materials that breach the blood-brain barrier, for example. So there's a whole host of questions that have to get addressed. It's it's untested, unstable, it's speculative in nature, and so it's a pretty big risk to take, in the hopes of dealing with addressing the challenges. And then I'd also point out that most folks who recognize the need to diversify the Richmond economy, which I think is the right answer, true diversity of the Richmond economy, and then the Bay Area economy in general, would recognize that a big part of the problem is Chevron's monopoly in the town. And then you step back and you look at Chevron's role in many of these companies and the big energy companies' investment in synthetic biology. So at the same time that they're shoving fossil fuels down our throat, they're supposedly funding the claims that this is the solution to the climate crisis. So there's a set of interests here that need to get unpacked before we jump in front of the silver bullet.
Yeah, I think we have to look at the record of the University of California, which is one of the key partners in this laboratory, their health and safety records. The University of California, the Regents, and an administrator at the UCLA has been sued by the district attorney because a laboratory worker died because of improper health and safety protection. Right now, today in California. And this is not a, high-tech biotech lab. This is a basic laboratory that the University of California Regents did not have proper health and safety at. So we have to ask ourselves, if they can't even protect a worker, a laboratory worker at the University of California, how can they be expected to protect a high-tech laboratory where new synthetic products are being produced? This is a real question. And there is no proper oversight in biotech, in synthetic biotech. That's a fact, which they don't want to address. We also have to look at, today is the anniversary of 3 Mile Island. And there's a connection, because the same people who are in the industry saying this is a safe technology, nuclear energy, nuclear reactors, want to continue to build nuclear plants and say that they're safe. They're safe. We can have safe nuclear plants. In fact, President Obama and the industry are saying we need to build more nuclear plants in the United States, and we'll subsidize them with tax dollars. Well, I have to argue for the safety of the whistleblowers, the workers, and the public. These aren't safe plants. Yet they're going to be spending more money, our tax dollars, to build these plants when whistleblowers are being fired and retaliated against in the United States at these plants like San Onofre and Diablo Canyon. So if we can't even protect the whistleblowers at nuclear plants and whistleblowers in high-tech biotech and plants, how can we go forward with this? This is a serious question for the people of California, for the people of the United States, and they're very much connected. We have to draw the connection. These new technologies, I'm not against technology. I use technology. My iPhone, video, and other things. We all use them. The question is, what are the potential dangers to these new technologies? And is there proper oversight and investigation of the danger? If they develop a new algae, supposedly to profit the oil companies, and this is released in the ocean by an earthquake, what is the impact of that if that technology starts to spread throughout the world in the oceans? We do know that these nuclear plants are releasing thousands, Fukushima, thousands of contaminated radioactive water from these plants that are being spread out throughout the world in the currents. What is the impact of that? We have to look at the impact of this and the dangers. And you know, one of the things about industry that people should understand is to the liabilities, cost, to offshore that. Have somebody else pay that. Have the government pay that. Have somebody else pay it. Well, why should the public have to pay for these industries' development of these technologies and put it off somebody else, their liability, put it off? I don't believe in that. I believe that when you develop a technology and a process, it shouldn't be offshored to somebody else to pay for that. And they don't want to put that into the program. That's not part of the program to investigate the cost that they're offshoring. Somebody else will pay for it. I don't believe somebody else should pay for it. I believe we need to understand what the costs are and what the potential dangers are before the development. So you have risk analysis before the accident happens, the disaster happens, rather than after.
At Asilomar, the scientists in the field were able to stave off more serious regulation by coming up with their own agreement, and that they should try and do the same here. They didn't even do the same here. And so what's that moment back in 1973, 1974, and now is that we have a multi-billion-dollar, in fact, be in the trillions if you include the interests of the pharmaceutical industry and so forth, biotech industry that's already producing and already committed to producing materials. So you know, the moment's not the same. You have companies such as DuPont, who has a large facility in Tennessee where they're making a bioplastic using synthetic microbes. You have Solazyme in South San Francisco with vats and vats of synthetic algae, which they're already selling to the U.S. Navy and to others. You have Amyris in Emeryville, who now have, I think, 1 or 2 facilities in Brazil that's already producing fuel. They're running buses in Sao Paulo with. You have Metabolics, which is like ADM, who are producing bioplastics and selling them like this. The industry's out the gate. It's already producing large quantities. And any idea that there's going to be a sort of a nice gentleman's agreement to have strong regulation, it's too late in a way. They need to be, that needs to be imposed from somewhere else. They're not going to do it themselves. But I think Marcy's probably...
Well, I'll just add briefly, actually we talked a little bit beforehand, that the lesson that a lot of us took from Asilomar was that even that very, very limited, very short-lived moratorium on certain kinds of experiments was too much, and that we don't want to go down that road because we might have to slow down for 6 months. And unfortunately, that's still what a lot of scientists are now taught. And I think that really does get in the way of researchers who are responsible, who see safety precautions, who would like to see a precautionary approach, are kind of discouraged or intimidated from speaking out that way. And my hope would be that the efforts of society organizations and scholars who are not directly involved with this research would give them some backbone. Because we know that in all these fields there are responsible researchers and scientists, and we need to hear from them as well as from this important work from society organizations.
I'd like to comment, please, on that also. I want to make a point out of the Asilomar conference. Those were guidelines. Those aren't really a framework that you can bring a corporation or a academic institute to court. They're guidelines. They don't have to follow it. When I went to the very head of Groton Labs, who's in charge of 6 employees, and I asked, what is going on here? What we're having exposures. What's Pfizer's position on this? They literally told me that Pfizer operates a safety budget on what is legal and not necessarily what is safe. What she told me. So, the whole culture of academia and the science has changed. When I first started, it was very interesting. I first started molecular biology in the 1980s. I was at Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and the first corporation came into that institute and started wheeling and dealing. I remember the professor I was working with came out and said, "Wonder what impact this is going to have on science." Well, I definitely see what impact it has on me. It has on me and has on the public. So I say the technologies have advanced so much now that we can't afford to give self-policing and self-regulation without some sort of justice system tied to it, or to ensure the responsibility of these groups. You tell me one CEO who has it in their principles that they're supposed to protect public health and safety. I think the principles are that they're supposed to make a profit for their company, and that's the bottom line.
Are there any countries or jurisdictions out there that you think that get it and are maybe creating some kind of regulatory models that you think would work?
Well, Sweden has some protections as far as the development of technology and labor and community having some impact on introduction of technology. So there's more protection in Sweden, which is going to be a socialist country by this country, but they do have some oversight. What we're seeing, though, in the United States, even in the GMO issue, genetic modified organisms, that U.S. companies are providing even notification to people when they go and buy a product that you have a GMO product. They don't want people to know in the United States what they're buying. Now, and this new agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which Obama is pushing, would prevent Japan and Australia and these other countries from having the right to have GMO-labeled products. So they're saying not only do you not have the right in the United States, they don't want around the rest of the world to have that right because they want these companies to be able to sell these products without people knowing. What kind of world are we in where a human being doesn't have the right to know what's in the food that they eat? And when that food is being genetically modified, when products are being spread out without any kind of oversight, serious oversight, we say this has to stop. We have to examine what's going on and the potential threat to our society and to workers. Becky was unaware of what new engineered organism was in her body, and she could not find out under the present laws. These laboratory workers in Richmond, if this laboratory is built, will be in the same situation. If a company that's invested in this laboratory has the copyright, which they do to these products, they won't even be able to find out what they've been infected with. This is a wild, wild, dangerous world we're living in. And people have to understand this is a threat that we need to look at and examine. That's why we're in this conference. What are the potential dangers? We're not saying that everybody is going to become infected, but what are the dangers? The fact of the matter is academics and biotech workers are afraid to speak out because they're afraid of being retaliated against. How can we protect our health and safety and really understand what's going on if people are afraid to actually raise a question for fear that they'll lose their job, they'll be fired, they won't be able to get health care. The other issue, which is very important in California and nationally, when biotech workers get infected and when they get sick, we don't even have the records of how many biotech workers have been infected already because of private control of health care. They sign secrecy agreements. They sign a privacy agreement saying, I won't talk about the fact that I've got a settlement with this biotech company, that I've been sick. Well, that means that the general issue of how is this affecting workers in the biotech industry, we don't know. These are real issues that people have to be concerned about. We don't know how many workers are getting sick. We do know in Becky's case, and they wanted her to sign a secrecy agreement, that she went public. But there are many biotech workers who might be getting sick. We don't know who they are.
I would make one extra comment that the oversight on these technologies needs to be multifaceted. It's time for the public to quit thinking that they're not smart enough to understand the risks. You can break down the risks to very simple concepts. I mean, if they're making synthetic organisms that can infect into a human, I mean, come on, you don't need to understand that how they're making them, or it's a danger. The public can understand this. The other thing is that if you don't have free speech with the frontline players, which are the biotechnologists, you don't have free speech, the public's not going to get transparency. So there's, you need a multifaceted type of oversight, and one is for sure the public needs to get involved, and you need free speech to biotech workers, and you don't have that now. So
we're in the same situation as we have been with a number of emerging technologies that governments are only just now beginning to wake up to there may be an issue here, and I think this is the pattern we see again and again, that increasingly our technologies get out of the gate and into the marketplace before anyone's had a chance to think and look at them. And then you end up with governments trying to play catch up at a point when they're already highly committed to the technology, sort of in the development side, and that's the case here. So there are, there was a presidential commission on bioethics 2 years ago, which looked at synthetic biology. Somewhat, it wasn't very strong in the US. The European Union is just beginning to look at kind of issues around regulation. Is there something that needs to be done here? As I mentioned, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a UN convention, is going to start looking at this possibly this month. But it was interesting, Steve, that you mentioned Sweden. Sweden used to have a proposal actually 20 years ago at the Earth Summit, Rio Earth Summit, for what they called Siesta, setting up an international technology assessment body that could look at the emerging technologies that were coming up and begin to put in place an anticipatory framework. And really, the Cetera Group feels very strongly that needs to happen even more so now, that it's not just a matter of running after synthetic biology or running after what's going on in nanotechnology or each one of these. And in some ways, this is specifically going to be an issue for the Bay Area. The Bay Area is the place where a lot of these emerging technologies are being developed. You have the Molecular Foundry here, you have a lot of the main nanotech companies, you have work going on geoengineering here, that if there's anywhere that there needs to be an anticipatory assessment of technologies very early on, it's here. The future comes here before it goes anywhere else in the world. And I imagine that could be done on a regional level if there was interest in it.
Are not going to come to the conference. My son was hurt in biolab. He first reported.
Sorry, can you tell us your name?
My name is Sandy Trend. My son's name is David Bell. It took. The first time he called OSHA was in 2002, August. Never heard anything. Had to get a hold of OSHA again in March of 2003. It took them 8 months. They finally find them, and what I find most absurd is that they said that the company meant minimum health and safety standards. When you're working with unknown microorganisms, you don't just in and you're accepted for minimum. This is very, very, very serious. Thank you.
Like, one of the challenges with all of these things, and one of the ways in which the science is the bright science, the methodology has been corrupted, is that we narrow our gaze down to one tiny little part and call that the thing. So in this case, it's like, well, I mean, everything that's being raised here is absolutely essential. I don't in any way want to suggest that like the protection. I believe that the protection of workers is the front line protection for everyone. However, the issue is if we narrow it down to the scope of just this lab and all the really extra special protections we would get there, or even just the applications of the industry, we're not addressing the entire life cycle, the full picture, right? And when you actually zoom out and look at the actual big picture in terms of the scale of resources required to harvest sugars out of biomass, to create fuels at scale, to fuel an economy that looks kind of like this one, but that runs on sugar carbon instead of fossil carbon, we realize that the regulations, what's required to make it safe it can't be done. It can't be done in the same way that we want to get off fossil fuels because we get that it's disrupting the atmospheric and hydrologic cycle, kicking people off their lands and destroying local economies and all of those things. We have to have that same kind of analysis around this. Like that I think is one of the key big questions here. The key thing you have to take out of it is the ability. Like, if you were the first step to making it at all even remotely worth looking at, is taking out the enormous amount of concentration of wealth and resources required to bring it to scale. And the moment you do that, it suddenly, like, no longer becomes an economically viable project to replace the fossil fuel industry. It's the taking other people's land, it's the making workers sick, it's the converting food to fuel, that is what makes it economically viable. It's displacing that cost. And if you were to internalize all the costs, you would find that it doesn't actually make any economic sense. I think that's one of the key things here. And I just want to quickly point out that in 2007 when we had the food crisis, a key part of that story, like we all saw pictures of Haitian women eating mud cakes during the food crisis in 2007. And a part of that story that wasn't told is the push for agrofuels, which displaced food production for fuel production on a planet where we're at the edge of our ability to mine for calories, created global crisis in the food system, right? So we're not, the scale inversion that people are talking about is not, there's no material basis for it in the planetary system. Like, we don't have the ability to do it the way they're claiming to do it. So the grand promises that are being made about getting ourselves off of fossil fuels and onto sugar-based fuels is what Nnimmo has called in the past a pipe dream. It's a pipe dream, and the pipe is long. The tailpipe is long, and the exhaust is in his community. And it doesn't matter how clean and pretty it looks in Richmond, and it really doesn't matter how many jobs it creates in Richmond on one level, because the scale of it is such that it's destructive in the big picture.
Second point on scale, which is that interestingly, in the last year or two, the synthetic biology industry has started to kind of admit that they might not be able to do biofuels because it's actually, biofuels are a low value commodity. You sell it for pennies at the end of the day. You make pennies, but you need large quantities of it. And that the moving from the sort of lab fermenters and sort of medium-sized fermentation that they already have, so they're making something about the size of a small microbrewery amounts at the moment, but moving to the millions of gallons that are required to have a real dent in the fuel system requires a technical feat that is proving difficult, if maybe even impossible. Now, the impact of that is not that the industry is going to pack up and go away. Those industries are up and they have lots of money. What we saw just recently was Amyris, which is always seen as the leader, and that's Jake Hiesling's company in Emeryville, that's actually based in the same building as J-Bay, which is going to go to Richmond, admitted that they're making a switch in strategy. They're now going to be, instead of making low value, high volume products, they're going to focus on high value, low volume products. So they're re-engineering their yeast to make for example, cosmetics or ingredients or plastics that they're re-engineering them for these markets. Now, often what they're doing is they're looking at natural products. So for example, take a company like Evolva, which Jake Hiesling is also interestingly on the board of. They're making vanilla in a microbe. So if they can make a large quantity of vanilla, or even a medium quantity of vanilla, and they can take the vanilla market, which is a very rich market, very quickly. They don't have to make as much as if they're making biofuels. But that has real implications for vanilla farmers in Madagascar and Reunion and so on. The same if they're working on shikimic acid, which is another one that Drath's Corporation is working on, and they're now owned by Amyris. Shikimic acid is used for Tamiflu. It comes from star anise, which is grown by Chinese farmers. For a little while, Chinese farmers thought they had a new market in Tamiflu, but as a result of Drath's and Roche now producing it through synthetic biology, that market just collapsed again. And so you can see that this switch now happening in the synthetic biology industry to go for these niche commodities is directly affecting farmers in the South. So that's sort of another wrinkle that's happening as they try and keep themselves profitable facing the inability to scale up. Does that make sense?
I have one comment on that also, on the scaling up. As a scientist regarding any reaction that you do, your materials need to be standardized. So even in Amherst, I was listening to the last conference with the students, and they said that their materials are changing, and they don't have enough. They first started with sugar, and then they went on wood chips, and their processes weren't working. So it's not going to be that easy to get a huge biomass of the same material, the same standardized material, to run a biological process. So it's impractical, just on terms of a scientific reaction.
You know, one of the issues, they say that they want to develop these technologies for energy. This is the purpose. We've got to save our energy. We've got to have green energy. This is what we have to do. Well, one has to ask the question in California, why isn't it a requirement that there be solar on all new construction if they want to save energy? California is a very rich state as far as the sun, yet there's no requirement that there be solar on all new construction in California. There's a disconnect, what we're talking about, a great disconnect between where the resources are going and what is needed to be done. California could be a 30%, 40% more energy efficient state if we had solar on all new construction. But that is not being done. Instead, we're developing these new technologies, synthetic biotechnology, for products which are really inefficient, which require government subsidies, because the industry itself doesn't want to put up the money for these development of these technologies. They want the taxpayer to pay for it, but they won't require in California solar energy. If the same money that was being used in synthetic technology was going to solar technology in California, we would be much more energy efficient. We would cut the use of fuels, coal and other fuels. The same thing with atomic energy. It's being subsidized. They want the taxpayer to pay for the insurance of the atomic energy industry. Because why is that? Bechtel, General Electric, these big companies make money from building nuclear plants, and that's the driving force, not an efficient use of energy. And this is what we have to look at as a society. We need an efficient use of our resources and energy, not what is going to make the most profit for a big multinational company. And that is what the disconnect is, and that's what we have to address. These are systemic issues, but we have to get at the same time what are the dangers at the ground floor, and what is the result in Nigeria? What is the result in Indonesia? What is the result in every area of the world for the people of the world? We don't want to destroy the farmers of the world so companies can make more profit for themselves, and that happens to be what the driving force is.